All right, hello everyone, and welcome to our third Lunch and Learn for Truth and Reconciliation Week 2024. My name is Sandra Bender. I'm the Bilingual Community Engagement and Education Program Coordinator with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that wherever we are watching from, either today or in the future, if you're watching this on our YouTube channel down the road, we are all located on the ancestral lands of the First Peoples. Some of those lands have been entered into treaty relationships, others have not. We acknowledge the land and waters that sustain all of our lives and the stewardship of the First Peoples in caring for those lands and waters since time immemorial. In 2023, the NCTR launched its adult education program for Truth and Reconciliation Week to address the gap in education and the hunger of the general public to learn more about the history and impacts of the residential school system and reconciliation. Due to the success of last year's program, the NCTR is hosting 5 adult education lunch and learn sessions with a variety of speakers throughout this week. This year's program is being presented with the generous support of Enbridge and the Canadian Public Health Association. Just to give us a bit of housekeeping before we begin, this is a Zoom webinar, so you'll see that the chat function is not enabled. You do have the ability to raise your hand, but we do not have the ability to unmute you and allow you to speak. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. We are going to try very hard to leave time for questions. I'll just note that there are several thousand of you in attendance, so we will definitely not get to respond to all of those questions, but we will do our best. We have ASL interpretation for this session, which you can watch here in the main channel, or you can switch under the interpretation channel, which looks like a globe, to watch from that channel as well. Et il y aura aussi une traduction simultanée en français disponible sous le bouton Interprétation en bas de l'écran. This session will be recorded and uploaded to the NCTR YouTube channel following the session, both the English with ASL as well as the French. The topic for today's session is Indigenous identity fraud and its harmful aspects and what can be done to address it. I'll be our moderator today, and we have 2 phenomenal speakers to lead us through this discussion: residential school survivor Francis Dickie Yuzicapi and journalist Michelle Cyca. Francis Dickie Yuzicapi comes from a cultural diverse heritage which represents the majority of the Plains cultures found in Saskatchewan to this day: Ojibwe, Cree, Métis, and Dakota. Dickie is unique in that he was raised by his great-grandparents who taught him traditional teachings before attending residential school. He is not only a survivor, but a multi-generational survivor. Dickie is currently the owner and chef of the Sous Chef Catering Company and consults on all facets of Indigenous culture. He is a master storyteller and experienced speaker who can provide his own ancestral context and historical connections in ways that bring the truth and reconciliation recommendations to practical reality. His workshops are led with great care to his family stories and to all participants' level of reconciliation. It's about creating understanding with care to lay the groundwork for what needs to be done to heal. Michelle Cyca, our other speaker, is a journalist living in Vancouver and a member of Muskeg Lake Cree Nation in Treaty 6. She is currently a senior editor at the Narwhal and a contributing writer to the Walrus. Her reporting, essays, and literary criticism can be found in the Globe and Mail, Chatelaine, Indigenous, Quill Inquirer, and the Tyee, among other publications. Her feature story, The Curious Case of Gina Adams, received the Gold Medal for Investigative Journalism and the Silver Medal for Long-Form Feature at the 2023 National Magazine Awards and was a finalist for the Canadian Association of Journalists Awards. So, welcome to the both of you. Welcome to everyone watching. Let's get right into it. Can you start us off by letting us know what Indigenous identity fraud is?
Michelle?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in.
You go.
Thanks everyone for being here today to talk about this with us. I'd say there's sort of 2 expressions of Indigenous identity fraud. So one is when people take like a family story or, a rumor about an Indigenous ancestor, a really distant one or a speculative one, and they spin that out into an identity of their own. And the other one is an outright fabrication of Indigenous identity that the person knows is not true. Where this tips over into fraud, I think, is when people use those claims that are unverified, that are maybe untruthful, that are very distant or speculative, and they leverage that for personal gain, whether that's taking up space that's meant for an Indigenous person or an opportunity that's meant for Indigenous people.
Are
What do you
there a
think,
couple?
Dickie?
Yeah, I'd love to hear yours too.
Basically, it just comes down to this, is the fact that as being First Nations, we all know who we are and we can prove who we are. The easiest way is to stay, well, I share this auntie, I share that uncle. These are my grandparents. And from that wording alone, that backs up everything that you say. So when you run into a person that is not First Nations or is stealing an identity, it's very easy to catch them. But the problem is trying to catch them in such a way that they lose where they're standing. Meaning, if they're already fraudulent already, they're already been hired in to do a job, and it's very hard to remove them from the position that they're at.
Mhm.
So that's the major problem. Like for me, yes, there's a lot of people that are doing it through schools, getting scholarships, stealing jobs. But the other side of it is the elderhood, having a person who's in the elder position and then is sharing everything that they supposedly know, and most of it is made up. And then that's what's been shared with our children and the younger generations. So in the long run, the people who are losing is our youth, the people who are of our ancestry, then are learning something from somebody who's fraudulent in the first place. And to me, that's the biggest no-no right there. It's all wrong, but especially when it comes to being an elder and sharing our culture and being in a position of teaching. Like, I don't know where they learned all the stuff that they supposedly know, but for me personally, I was raised by my great grandparents from a generation that had no influence from anybody from Europe.
Mhm.
So I learned from the source, and that's what I share with everybody. So whoever these people are, and there's a few out there that I know of. I'm not saying names, but they're out here and they're in positions where they're actually taking money away from our own elders, being paid to do whatever they're doing. So, like I said, fraud is fraud, no matter which way you look at it. That's
Absolutely. Could you give us a couple of examples, like real ones or a hypothetical example?
Sure.
sure.
I mean, oh,
Go ahead.
yeah, I can start. I think one that
Yeah,
a lot of people are familiar with is Joseph Boyden, who is a very well-known author. I think at the time uh, of the investigation into his identity, who was maybe one of the most well-known quote unquote Indigenous authors in Canada, and was investigated in 2016 by Kwantlen journalists Robert Jago and APTN. And he had, at various times claimed to be Mi'kmaq and Anishinaabe and Métis, but had no verifiable Indigenous ancestry. Um, there have also been a lot of cases reported of people fabricating their identity in academia and in the arts. Those are two sectors where we see a lot of really prominent examples. Though I think when we're talking about these examples, it's important to remember there's, for every famous person you've heard of in the media who's lied about being Indigenous, there's probably hundreds of people who are not well known enough or have a high enough public profile to ever be exposed through that kind of investigation. And those people are doing just as much harm.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Dickie.
personally, I ran into a few all over the country. Like I sit on the national board of residential school survivors, this is Circle Survivor Board. And I've been to a lot of different places throughout the country, and a lot of times we follow and run into the odd one here and there. So as a group, we do the old vetting system. So one starts asking questions, next one starts asking questions, and next thing you know, there's five, six, seven, eight of us all kind of surround the person and bombard them with question after question. And usually, what happens is they leave or run.
Mhm.
A lot of times I've been in ceremonies where people will come up and they ask this person to say a prayer. And when an elder says a prayer, they don't usually use a microphone. Some do, some don't, but it's audible. You actually hear them saying a prayer. And on many occasions, we've heard, well, I heard two or three of them that just mumble. There's nothing coming out. So to me, that's a red flag. And the thing is, like, even some of our elders who don't speak their traditional language will then pray in English or French. They'll say a prayer where they actually audibly say a prayer out loud. And the thing is, there's nothing wrong with it, but prove who you are. I mean, we all can prove it because we all have that little piece of paper from the government as First Nations. Métis have their own cards. So it is a carded system. We have to prove who we are. We have to vet where we come from. And these pretendians don't. They have no backup.
Yeah.
So that to us, that's a telltale sign. That's why what we're doing is because we want to prove that either you are or you aren't, and just get it out there in the open. To me, that's what should be done.
Yeah. I agree. And I mean, I know I shouldn't be looking at the chat, but I see a question there that I just want to build on what Dickie's saying. There's often this idea that people can't prove their identity because they don't have the documents. Things were lost in fires, or, they hid from the government. This is like a really common story that people use when they're caught saying things that can't be proven. And, something that I think most Indigenous people would say is, I have a status card from the federal government, but my knowledge of my family comes from family. The idea that you would be from an Indigenous community, and as Dickie said before, you wouldn't have aunties, you wouldn't have cousins, you wouldn't have any connections. No one there would know your family or who you are. That doesn't make any sense from a First Nations perspective. I think there's lots of people who are Indigenous who don't have government documentation, whether they've chosen not to enroll or they're not eligible for the federal system, but they have family who know who they are. And so when you do have someone who's saying, well, I can't prove it because my family hid in the woods from the Indian agents and then everything was lost in a fire, like, I'm sorry, but just to be blunt, that's just not a very plausible story. It doesn't make sense to Indigenous people. If somebody has no cousins, that's a strange thing in our circles. I'll just leave it there.
Bit of an obvious red flag.
I don't want to get ahead of ourselves in this conversation, but yeah, someone with no cousins, no aunties, that's a little bit weird.
Well, you talked about proof, both of you, in mentioning things like official Indigenous status as granted by colonial systems, but you also talked, Michelle, about family, about being known in community. And I think sometimes, especially settlers can get too caught up in, government proof. But the proof is really in the relationships, as you were saying, how you're known in community, how you've been taught by your elders, how you have come by the things that you're now teaching. So if you can't back that up with believable stories, then maybe that's one of the first signs.
Yeah. And I think it's about truthfulness, like not every Indigenous person has the same story. I didn't grow up on a reserve. I grew up in the city. You can tell by looking at me that, I don't have two Indigenous parents. I have one Indigenous parent. I don't think those things make me less Indigenous, but it's necessary, I think, to be truthful about your origins, to be able to, demonstrate that you're telling a truthful story. That's really important. And so what we see often in these stories is, you can see exaggerations, you can see claims that are not verified or disputed by members of the community who are being claimed by somebody. And that's where the concern is. It's dishonesty. It's not that everybody should have an identical family story or that there's only one way to be Indigenous, but people need to be making truthful claims. They need to be honest.
So what are then? I'm still struggling to understand why someone would pretend to be something that they're not, or someone that they're not. What's the benefit there, and what are some of the harms in that?
The way I see it is that some people will take it as a fantasy, something that they read a story as a child. And then, like, for instance, we'll say Gray Owl. He was a, real guy. He came from England. He wanted to be something more than what he wasn't. But then once he came to this country, he then became the Indian and then moved up north, set up a camp, right out on a canoe, and he played the part. And most of the First Nations around knew exactly what he was. And at the end, they did confront him at the end, but they didn't do it in such a way that was mean. They honored him in a system because he was actually somebody from a good heart doing it. But that's an exception. There's many who are not good to the heart to do this because they go it as another way of saying this is the easy way of taking a whole bunch of money from somebody else because the government just gives out money blindly, meaning they don't vet the people who go in and get all these scholarships and stuff. But yet in nowadays, you see so many people, not going to say names, but a lot of many educated people out there who have taken lots and lots of money away from people who are rightfully First Nations, who rightfully have a right to that money because it was, meant for them, but taken otherwise. So it comes down to the fact that the person who is identifying or stealing the identity, they're looking at it as a total different way of making money, of taking that and having the fame to go with it. But the thing is, it still comes down to the fact that they're not who they are. So it's kind of up to us as First Nations to sniff them out and, put them out in the open.
I'm seeing a lot of questions about 60 scoop survivors. So I just want to say, I think there's sort of two things here to distinguish between. One is that many people are on a journey of reconnection, whether that's connecting with their culture, finding their family, and those people do deserve support. They deserve openness on that journey. I think that's really important. But, when we're talking about people who are stepping into positions of authority and power on the basis of an identity claim, whether they're presenting themselves as elders, they're applying for jobs that are meant for Indigenous people or grants or opportunities like that, on the basis of this claim, if you don't know who you are yet, if you're still looking for your family, if you're still trying to understand your culture and identity, then is it your place to be presenting yourself as an authority in that way and to be really making a claim in a public sense, in a professional sense, that relies on that claim? I would say people should be going on these journeys for their identity. Once they're trying to profit off that identity without understanding it first, then I think people are within their rights to ask questions. And, as I said, if people are truthful about where they come from, I think there shouldn't be any shame in being on a journey of reconnection. But it's important as Indigenous people that we can ask each other, as Dickie said, where are you from? Who's your auntie? Like, who is your family? These are questions that we've used to trace those connections and relationships. They're not invasive questions. They're basic questions. They're respectful. They're a way of understanding each other and relating to each other. And so I feel like, there's this misunderstanding, I think, that asking somebody, oh, what nation are you from? Or where's your family from? Or, who are you related to? Like, you're from Saskatchewan. Do you know this person? That those questions are somehow like rude or too invasive to ask. Those are questions Indigenous people always ask each other. It's okay if you don't feel like you have a perfect answer, but, as we've said, you should be answering truthfully. So I just want to say that, we're not trying to alienate anybody from discovering who they are, but when we're talking about people who are taking enormous opportunities and taking up enormous amounts of space in these communities, in these, in the public consciousness and presenting themselves as Indigenous, then we do need to make sure that those people are who they say they are.
Well, you've mentioned, and I know you've done work, Michelle, on things like official knowledge keepers that an institution has hired, or an elder in residence. And Dickie, I know when we chatted about this, you spoke about pretendians, to use that language for it, of elders who were not legit. So you've talked, both of you, about people profiting off massive financial opportunities. Yeah, would you like to, either of you, say more about that, about what harms that causes beyond just depriving a legitimate Indigenous person, elder, knowledge keeper, from having that opportunity?
Well, that's the biggest thing right there is the fact that there are a few of them, and there's more throughout the country, some that we don't know about, but they're just under the radar. They get hired up to take these positions, and the thing is, these financial institutions or schools or whatever institution will hire an elder, and they don't vet them. They don't do the questioning. It's like our first thing about being an elder is you gift them tobacco, and then you ask them questions. who are you? Where are you from? That kind of stuff. Like when we do our ceremonies and stuff and we need new elders to do our ceremonies, we will literally take tobacco out and offer tobacco to visiting visitors and elders. And then those are the questions that are taught and asked. And then from there, we kind of get the gist of it, whether you are or you aren't. And like I said, there is about three, four elders in our area here that are, are not. You know it. You just look at them, you hear their answers, you see what they do. And the thing is, it's a very difficult position to try and change it, flip it, or
Mm.
have our legitimate elders go into place and replace them because these institutions will not admit that they were wrong. Because that's the biggest thing right there. It's once they say they were wrong, then, geez, are they really going to hire any more elders? Are
Mm.
they actually going to keep doing this right thing that should be done? I mean, it is our land. It is our place. Like everybody else is still a visitor. Like a lot of people say, well, we signed treaties. Well, yeah, we did, but they were never honored and they
Mm.
still aren't. So it's like we're it's always an upwards battle for us as being First Nations and Inuit and Métis. I mean, even the Métis people, I mean, there's that big thing. They always say the Métis is from Winnipeg West. I mean, that's where the Forks and that's where the Métis people started. So even on that side of it, like the Métis will get mad over the fact they'll say, well, Métis are not east of that. Well,
Mm.
I am a part of the Métis family. I am. And the thing is, it's a constant battle no matter which way you look at it. And the fact that we're bringing in this pretendian and we're dealing with this on a different level, it brings in all kinds of other atrocities that come in with it. Because one thing that I always say is, okay, fine, they want to play Indian, they want to play pretend to be this. They didn't go through all the stuff that we went through. They didn't earn that.
Mm.
Like we grew up with, racial hatred and all kinds of stuff and all the other atrocities of being residential school survivors and sons and daughters and grandchildren of them. But and yet they're profiting off of it. So that kind of, throws a monkey wrench in the pile. To me, it's a personal hit. It is. And a lot of us as First Nations, we hold that as a grudge. And this is one thing that we would like to get rid of. For me, that is.
When we chatted, I remember you speaking too about false elders then passing down incorrect teachings. And that transmission of cultural knowledge is such an important part of the role of elders in community, right?
Exactly. Like for instance, myself, I come from three different tribes, Cree, Soto, and Dakota. Now, I was raised by my great grandparents and they kept it separate, Cree, Ojibwe, and Dakota. So when I tell stories of cultural stories, I keep them separate all the way through. Now, today, a lot of our elders are all survivors of residential school or trauma. So they have little parts torn off of them. I call it a Swiss cheese effect.
Mm.
So when they get to a certain age and they become an elder, now they go into their original teachings and they try to fill in the holes where, missing parts. Some will then go to another tribe and fill it up. And to me, that's, it's skewed the teachings. So when now they teach that to our children and our grandchildren, the teaching has been skewed or messed up, or it's not the true teaching. So that's us as First Nations. They're backed up, they're real elders. But now we're using a pretendian elder who read it from a book
Mm.
or learned it from a movie or heard it from another elder. And now they mix all this all together and they create something that is false completely. And then they get hired on by a white institution. And then they're spreading what they say is truth to everybody else.
Mm.
So to me, that's the major slap in the face to our people because now we're using somebody who's not even trying to say that's truth. It
Right.
isn't. So to me, that's like it's very bad. It's not good for our people, and that's got not good for every other person around because our traditional teachings, like for instance, our Nahil teaching, we have four great nations that were created: red, white, yellow, black nations from all the world, and everybody's very important to our circle of life. And we have our one part, and we share with everybody so they understand who we are.
Mm.
And the thing is, if somebody else is, making stuff up, then where's the truth? What happened to it? Because it's, now gone. So all of us who are still here have to fix that problem. So that's a lot of fixing.
Well, it is, and it's a little bit difficult to know even how to go at it. You talked about that one, sort of method of questioning people directly, one-on-one. But when it's something like an institution that's hired a false person, a non-legitimate Indigenous cultural advisor or something. Michelle, you said like we should be able to ask these questions as questions of figuring out how we relate. Um, what happens then when it's on this institutional level? You talked about it needing to be safe for people to be able to ask those questions.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think, the institutional entanglement here makes this really complicated. And where Indigenous identity fraud, I think, has become such a subject of public interest is there's now quite a bit of awareness that this is happening in institutions that have tried to advance reconciliation or decolonization by creating rules and opportunities for Indigenous people. And, when those opportunities were created, many of them were based on self-identification. All you had to do was say, oh yeah, I'm Indigenous. And if you had the other credentials that were being sought, you might just get into this position. And so we see that in the arts, we see that, as I mentioned, in universities, in government, in all kinds of positions. And I think that there's a couple things to consider. So one is, the verification up front, which is that people should be demonstrating that they are who they say they are, whether that's, showing a status card that proves that they have a membership in the First Nation that they claim they do, or connections with that community that can be demonstrated another way. A big problem here that I think, leads to these frauds kind of getting a foothold is that a lot of the people who are trying to fix this problem of underrepresentation of Indigenous people are not themselves Indigenous. So they don't recognize these red flags that Dickie and I have mentioned. They don't really know what to ask. They're not familiar with Indigenous communities or Indigenous stories. And that's not necessarily their fault. A lot of Canadians are ignorant of these things through because Indigenous people have been kept on the margins of the Canadian consciousness for so long. But it's a problem. It's a problem that's non-Indigenous people often who are ushering someone in who fits their idea of what an Indigenous person looks like. And then the accountability question is complicated because for institutions, I don't think that it's simply a matter of the fact that they don't know how to ask or verify this information. I also think we have to reckon with the fact that many institutions don't want to, to have built up somebody who gives your institution credibility as an Indigenous person, as a person with cultural teachings, with wisdom, who's maybe published things or created art or told stories that reflect well on you, that have brought money to your institution or organization, that have given you this kind of credibility. It's embarrassing. It's, I think a lot of universities, a lot of government agencies, a lot of public bodies, they don't want to admit that they've made a mistake because it would be damaging to their reputation, because they've hired this person who they like and now they have a personal relationship with them. And they kind of hope that they can, just like hide their head in the sand and maybe it'll go away. I think a lot of people don't actually want to know the truth. And that's a difficult thing to get your head around. I think that's a painful part of this is a lot of Indigenous people, when they raise concerns that someone might not be truthful, they get shut down because opening up that line of inquiry is not something that every organization or leader wants to do. And to me, that's one of the biggest barriers, is that there is this real reluctance. So part of this, again, to go back to your question, Sandra, is about creating processes and understanding how to do things better so that these loopholes and gaps in process that allow frauds to slip into positions of power are closed. But the bigger challenge, I think, is about that humility and that accountability, that institutions that want to do right by Indigenous people have an ethical responsibility to confront if they've made a mistake and to try and make it right. Because as Dickie has said, there's so many harms of, sharing false information, sharing false ideas about Indigenous people, educating youth about things that are not true. These are huge harms. And so I think that responsibility is a really big piece of it.
Thank you for all of that. Yeah, the whole institutions needing to save face thing is a real problem. There have been a couple of questions about if there's a role for allies in this process. I think that seems like one of the obvious answers. If it's so-called allies running these institutions, to be held accountable and be humble enough to have their errors pointed out to them and then to rectify them. Would you see other roles for allies as well? We have so many questions. I'm trying to get to at least the main themes.
I want to know what Dickie's thoughts are on this, but I do see I've seen a couple of people asking, is it appropriate for me as a non-Indigenous person to ask someone for proof? I mean, I don't think you would necessarily say, okay, like, show me your papers, but yes, absolutely. If you are hiring someone and they say, I'm a member of the Muskeg Lake Cree Nation, it's not inappropriate to ask them to demonstrate that. That's, if someone was hired as a biology teacher and you said, okay, can I see your biology degree? That's not an invasive question either. So yes, it's appropriate. I think also, as I said, that knowledge piece, understanding, learning about First Nations and Métis and Inuit, learning about these communities so that you feel comfortable asking those questions, I think is a big one. If you're too uncomfortable to ask an Indigenous person a direct question about who they are and where they're from, I mean, I really wonder if you're ready as an individual or as an organization to be hiring people into these roles of trust and authority. You need to have that competence and that awareness, that education yourself to do that job responsibly. So yeah, Dickie, I'm very curious for your thoughts.
Well, exactly. I mean, if you're going to be hiring someone for a position, even if it is an advisory position, you have to have written down exactly what you're looking for. You're not just going to go give it to Joe Schmo over here because he has long braids and he says, and he looks the part and he's got the big nose and he's dark skinned and he looks like a traditional Indian. Well, you have to ask them questions. It's called vetting. When we hire people on our home reserves for schools, for teachers and elders, it's an interview process. And if they get offended by being asked questions and obviously they're not really who they say they really are, it's like you have to prove who you are. Doesn't matter. It goes to any kind of job. Like for instance, I'm a master chef. I run my own catering company. I started from the bottom rung when I started working in restaurants. I've been working professionally since I was 14 years old. I went through every kind of interview process, asked questions, all this, and you have to prove that you had your papers to be a chef. You bring it out, all your certificates. There's no certificate to say that you're an elder, but there is answering questions of knowledge that you have. Who did you study under? Who was your teachers? Drop the names of who you learned from, because these people that you learned from are your heroes. They're your teachers. They're your grandparents. By saying all this stuff and dropping all the names, you're proving to them who you are, where you came from. So if a pretendian starts dropping all these names of people who don't exist, you're not real. And being First Nations, drop a few names here and there. People know everybody. That's why before the internet, we had this thing called the Moxon Telegraph. That's where all the aunties and moms would get on the phone and they'd talk back and forth. I remember growing up as a kid with my grandparents. My grandmother was on a party line and they'd all be talking. And, stuff got around pretty quick. I mean, you can't hide. If you're not real, like they're going to catch you. It's like if this stuff was happening, like say when my grandparents were still alive when I was a kid, it would been dealt swiftly and abruptly because that's how the old people were. They didn't have time to mess around and they got to the point pretty quick. It's like the old saying goes, walk tall with a big stick. That's the kind of attitude that the people who raised me, that's how I was raised. I mean, my great grandparents, they, lived on the prairies before they were put on reserves. So the people who raised me, like I always say, I was raised by the last of the wild Indians. Those were my great grandparents. So I learned from the source. So there was no messing around. So if you earned your way through those old people, you earned your way through it. And it shows with just the way you talk, the way you run yourself, the way you live life. Like all these guys are shook and jive, and they'll say anything to get by. And that's how they end up stealing money and, stealing positions and robbing it from people who legitimately should have those positions. Now, the other part of it I see is that when the Truth and Reconciliation came out, everybody jumped on it. Oh, we're going to hire now First Nations people. Oh, we're going to got to get one in our organization. So this is where the problem comes into play, is that these organizations are not taking the time to actually vet real from not real. And it only takes a few questions to ask, and your inner sense should take over. Anybody should sniff out something that's not real. It's just a matter of the right questions. I might be stepping over the line here and there, but that's the way I see it. And if anybody gets offended by it, oh well, that's how it goes. But the truth has to come out at some point in time. So somebody will mess up, and there have been a handful, maybe two handfuls of them that have been caught so far. And there's a lot out there that haven't. It's just a matter of time.
That's a really good point. And there have been questions about, is this a really prevalent problem? And I think I'm hearing from both of you that yes, it is. There have been a lot of questions as well about the basis of identity, and questions related to the one you answered about the 60 scoop, Michelle, about people who didn't grow up in community or didn't have that opportunity to gain that cultural knowledge through traditional means and are looking for that. I'm not hearing from either of you that you're specifically castigating people for having been cut off from their traditional roots. You're talking about people who don't actually have those traditional roots, and haven't learned but are still pretending that they hold that knowledge. Is
Yeah.
that
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a couple of variations of this question in the chat. I think, I've seen people asking, like, is Indigenous identity genetic or is it cultural? I would say, I mean, there's two things here. What Dickie's spoken about and what I often speak about is citizenship. You're part of a nation, they're called First Nations. That's not a phrase. They're distinct nations that existed long before Canada, that continue to exist today. And so I'm a citizen of Canada, but I'm also a member of a First Nation. And, not everybody has membership. But again, those are living connections. They're familial connections. Some of them might be fragmented or frayed by colonialism, but they're real. So I don't think it's a DNA test thing. I don't think it's just about, having an understanding of the culture, because that can be acquired. There are lots of settlers who have a deep, rich understanding of Indigenous culture, but they know that doesn't make them Indigenous. It is something more than that. It's a distinct connection to a living Indigenous nation. That's what I would say. But again, for people who are, who feel like they're disconnected or they're on a learning journey, again, there's no shame in that. That's something, I think a lot of people do grapple with that shame. It's something that I've written about and thought about a lot. But again, it's just being honest about where you're at. Like, I would never present myself as a cultural authority or an expert in cultural teachings that I don't hold. I really try and be honest about the fact that, I'm learning the Cree language. I'm learning about these things still, that, my position is someone who was raised outside the community, off reserve, in connection with my family, but not with the same kind of experience that someone who grows up on the reserve has. And there's space for all of that. I don't think, again, that people should feel like they have to exaggerate or misrepresent their origins or where they are in their journey. If anything, I think, you can see in some of the pretendian stories that have come to public attention, like Carrie Barassa, like Buffy St. Marie. I see a lot of questions about Buffy, that there's this reliance on stereotypes, stereotyped ideas about what an Indigenous person's life is, this trauma, like this addiction, all these family shame and family secrets. Like, those are realities for a lot of Indigenous people, but we see this pattern of exaggerating and drawing on this like very specific archetype of an Indigenous person who's like suffering, who's who's grown up in like these very dire circumstances. it plays to these ideas, these limited ideas of what Indigenous people are. And I think we do need to resist that narrative. Like there's like a lot of Indigenous people who are connected and have grown up with their culture, who have been raised in their community with their teachings, who have strong relationships, strong, healthy relationships, who are thriving. And so I don't know, I feel like I've gone off on a little bit of a tangent here, but I think, again, not to hit this point over and over, but it's important to be truthful. If you're being truthful, you don't have to be ashamed.
Yeah, that that sounds like a basic, but not necessarily one that would just occur to us. As far as I know, there aren't any legal, at least per colonial law, the laws of Canada, legal consequences for someone falsifying Indigenous identity, are there?
Not as far as I know. I
Yeah.
mean, like maybe there should be.
Yeah,
Hopefully,
this
at
one
some point,
is,
something. Go ahead. Sorry.
oh no, you go.
I'm just saying it. At some point, maybe something should be turned into something. I mean, there should be some laws against it, so there should be some consequence for lying, because that's technically what they're doing, is they're
Mm.
lying. I mean, the other part of it is too, is like there's so many people out there starving for knowledge of our cultures. I mean, personally, I moved to Toronto years ago to become and to be a chef, and I apprenticed at the Royal York Hotel. And I went to one of the, there was an evening, I was on the subway and saw some native boys with hand drums. I was, hey, where you guys singing, kind of thing. And they said, well, we're going to the Friendship Center. So we're singing tonight. And I had a free night. So I just went along, followed them, got there, and the way they were drumming wasn't the way we drum back west. And so I took one of their hand drums, showed them how to drum the way the Cree people drum our hand drums. And they're all amazed looking at me. And that's where I came to a realization. It's so easy to fall into a position where you can push people this way or that way if you have just a little bit of knowledge. And that's where the truthfulness comes into play, is you're taking just that little piece and you're sharing just that little piece. And if you're truth about it, nothing comes of it. But if you don't know, you can take that little piece and turn it into something way bigger. And you're moved into a position of gaining notoriety, of being something that you're not. See, that's the difference between a true First Nations person and what we call we trust a holy man, or someone that walks the red road. We have that truth that follows with us, and we can't lie about it. We just share. But if someone's in that position of pretending to be that, they can take that a whole different way. And then from there, that's where the pretendian elder comes into play.
Yeah.
Because of the fact that a lot of our own people are all over the place, and they're starving for that knowledge. So whoever has a little bit of knowledge and they jump on it, that's where it comes into play. And next thing you know, there's a false, elder.
Yeah.
And I hate to say it, but it's very easy for someone to do that, just for the fact that there's a lot of us First Nations that don't have all the traditional knowledge or the teachings. So when they do see someone, they all jump on it. So like I said, when I'm asked to do something, I'll truthfully go out there and share it and go from there. Because like I always say, if you have questions, ask, because I'm not afraid to answer questions. They're just questions. And if you don't know the answer, you just don't know the answer.
Yeah.
But to someone who doesn't know the answer because they don't know anything, it's a pretty hard situation. So they make stuff up.
So it's not even just about being legitimately Indigenous, but if you don't have the knowledge, then passing yourself off as a knowledge keeper, or an elder or a cultural advisor is also not it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to just go back to the question about legal consequences, because there is now one precedent, which several people in the chat have pointed out, which is Nadia and Amira Gill, where the twins who claim to be Inuit, their mother applied for Inuit beneficiary cards for them by lying and saying they were adopted from an Inuk woman. And their mother was actually charged with fraud because she deliberately lied. But something in that case that I find really frustrating is, even though those twins were, I think, 16 or 17 when they received those cards, they claim that they didn't know that this was fraud, and the charges against them were dropped when their mother pled guilty. To me, that seems kind of outrageous and demonstrates how, there is this permissiveness in the legal system. I think if people are lying for material gain, that is fraud. The Métis lawyer Jean Thier has said this repeatedly, that we are talking about fraud in the literal sense. So I think there should be consequences. There's legal consequences, but in terms of what I think I would also like to see that I've never seen from anybody who's been caught fabricating or exaggerating their Indigenous identity is reparations, a sincere apology for the harm they've caused, paying back money that was given to them that they shouldn't have received, humility about, trying to teach others about what they did wrong and try and curb this phenomenon of Indigenous identity fraud. I haven't seen any of that. When people get called out, they disappear, they go silent, they move. Joseph Boyden, I think, is just teaching in the US now somewhere. Nobody has demonstrated how to make amends for this harm. And I would really like to see that. I think, legal consequences are one path. But I also think there's an accountability one that I would find significant too, is just what would it look like for somebody to apologize in a meaningful and significant way? I think that's really important too. And another thing that Dickie's comments made me think of is, again, that presenting yourself as a cultural authority, if you're not one, is a form of fraud. And I think institutions need to move past this sort of this reflex that they had when, as Dickie said, the TRC report came out that, really made a lot of places think, okay, we got to hire some Indigenous people. I think you need to ask, what are you trying to do when you're hiring an Indigenous person? Are you trying to correct for historic marginalization, for racism and oppression that primarily affects visibly Indigenous people? Are you trying to connect with the nations on whose homelands you're operating on, in which case you should be building relationships with the First Nations that surround you, as opposed to just like hiring any Indigenous person who applies for that job? Are you trying to bring cultural teachings into your institution, in which case finding someone who is a knowledge keeper would be important? Like, I really think a lot of places have not actually thought about what they're trying to do, besides that maybe they just want to be able to say, yeah, we've got an Indigenous person now, here they are, like, look at them.
And also reconciliation accomplished.
Yeah, exactly. Like it really feels, I
we
think,
found one. Good.
Yeah, it feels like a check mark. Like it can feel very perfunctory. So if you, as a leader, as an organization, as a, whatever your role in this is, if you're engaging with Indigenous communities, if you're trying to hire Indigenous people, really get clear with what your intentions are and start from there. I think there's a lot of universities that, post how many Indigenous staff and faculty they have, but who don't have any relationships with the actual First Nations whose lands they're on. I think that's a problem. I think people assume every Indigenous person is a cultural expert. That's not fair to people who are disconnected from their teachings, and it puts them in a strange position, and is also, encourages people to misrepresent what they know. So I think, not to slide too far into like didactics and what everyone should be doing about this, but I think that's a big one. Like, what are you trying to do?
Yeah. This conversation is so important and so fascinating. I'm so sorry to say that we're at the end of our time. I know that there are so many questions that have not been answered, but I think that you've both touched on the major themes. So on behalf of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, I'd really, really like to thank you both, Dickie and Michelle. Thank you all for being here and taking the time out of your days to come and learn. To access this video after this ends, you can always find it on the NCTR's YouTube channel. You'll find both today's session as well as yesterday's and Monday's. If you're interested in registering for the other sessions this week, you can access those. I'm just going to put a link in the chat. It is not too late to register for those ones. Tomorrow's is on the subject of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That will actually be a hybrid event held in Ottawa. Here is that link. And then Fridays will be on the subject of addressing the ongoing barriers to us being able to achieve reconciliation. So do, if you want, register and watch live with us, or find those on YouTube and watch at your own convenience. So with that, thank you all. Merci, miigwech.